Have you ever stood at a funeral and felt that something was terribly, horribly wrong? I mean really wrong. Not just the natural sadness of loss, but a deep, gut-wrenching sensation that screams at you to do something, anything, before it's too late? Well, let me tell you about the day I stopped a funeral, the day I saved a woman's life, and how that single decision changed everything I thought I knew about trust, betrayal, and the thin line between life and death. My name doesn't matter, but what I did that gray October afternoon in 2019 matters more than anything I've ever done in my entire existence. I was 32 years old, working a dead-end job at a marketing firm, going through the motions of life like so many of us do when I received an invitation to attend the funeral of Margaret Sullivan, the aunt of a colleague I barely knew. I almost didn't go. I remember standing in my apartment that morning, holding the black invitation card, feeling the weight of obligation pressing down on my shoulders. I didn't know Margaret. I had never met her. But my colleague, Sarah, had been kind to me during a particularly difficult project, and I felt I owed her this small gesture of support. Little did I know that this decision would lead me to the most terrifying and extraordinary experience of my life. The funeral home was one of those old Victorian buildings that seemed to hold centuries of grief within their walls, with tall windows that let in pale, filtered light, and the overwhelming scent of lilies and roses that made my head spin the moment I walked through the heavy wooden doors. There were maybe 40 people there, scattered throughout the chapel, their faces etched with various degrees of sorrow, though I noticed something odd right away. Many of them seemed more uncomfortable than grief-stricken, shifting in their seats, avoiding eye contact with one another, whispering in hushed tones that felt more like gossip than mourning. I found a seat in the back row, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible, and that's when I first saw the casket at the front of the room, a beautiful mahogany box with brass handles, surrounded by an excessive amount of white flowers that seemed almost theatrical in their abundance. The service began with a priest I would later learn had never actually met Margaret, reading from prepared notes in a monotone voice that suggested he'd performed this ritual 1,000 times before with the same lack of genuine emotion. As he spoke about a woman he didn't know, using generic phrases about her kindness and her love for her family, I found my attention wandering to the people around me, studying their faces, trying to understand the strange atmosphere that permeated the room like an invisible fog. Sarah sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but when she turned slightly I could see that her eyes were dry, and there was something in her expression that I couldn't quite name. Was it relief? Anxiety? Fear? My hands started to sweat, and I felt this inexplicable urge to stand up and leave, to get away from whatever was happening in that chapel. But I remained seated, frozen by social convention and a growing sense of dread that I couldn't explain or rationalize. The priest finished his remarks and invited people to come forward and pay their final respects before the burial, and that's when everything changed, when my life split into a before and after that I'm still processing years later. I watched as people formed a line, walking slowly past the casket, some touching it gently, others merely pausing for a moment before moving on, and I felt compelled to join them, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. As I approached the casket, I could see Margaret's face through the partially open lid, and she looked peaceful, her skin pale and waxy, her hands folded over her chest in that traditional pose of eternal rest, and I was about to turn away when I saw it. The slightest, almost imperceptible movement of her chest, a tiny rise and fall that lasted maybe a second, but it was there. I saw it, and my heart stopped. I froze completely, my mind racing to process what I had just witnessed, telling myself I was mistaken, that grief and the strange atmosphere had made me see things that weren't there. But then I saw it again, another small movement, and this time I was certain, absolutely certain, that this woman was alive, that Margaret Sullivan was breathing in her casket, about to be buried alive. My hands started shaking uncontrollably, and I felt sweat running down my back despite the coolness of the chapel, and I knew I had to do something, had to say something, but who would believe me? Would they think I was insane? Would they be angry at me for disrupting the service? But how could I stay silent when a human being was about to be buried alive? These thoughts crashed through my mind in the span of maybe 3 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. And then I heard myself, speaking, my voice loud and shaky, cutting through the somber silence like a knife. I said something I'll never forget, something that felt both absurd and absolutely necessary in that moment, and the room erupted into chaos, into accusations and denials and confusion. But I didn't care because I knew what I had seen, and I knew I had to act. Consequences be damned. And that decision, that split-second choice to trust my own eyes and my own instincts over social convention and the judgment of strangers, that's what saved Margaret's life, and that's what changed mine forever. The moment I shouted those words, "She's alive, she's breathing. Someone call 911. The entire chapel seemed to freeze in a tableau of shock and disbelief, faces turning toward me with expressions ranging from horror to anger to complete bewilderment. And I could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes on me, judging me, questioning my sanity, my motives, my right to be there at all. Sarah jumped up from her seat in the front row, her face flushed red, and she started walking toward me with quick, angry steps, her mouth open as if to scream at me, to tell me to leave, to accuse me of being drunk or high or mentally unstable. But I stood my ground, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears like a drum. And I pointed at the casket with a trembling finger and repeated, louder this time, "She's breathing." I saw her chest move. "She's alive." The priest dropped his Bible and it hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the chapel. And for a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all just stood there in this surreal suspended animation. And then an older man, who I would later learn was Margaret's brother Thomas, rushed forward to the casket, his face pale and his hands reaching out to check for himself, to see if this crazy stranger in the back row could possibly be telling the truth. I watched as Thomas leaned over his sister's body, his ear close to her face, and I saw the exact moment when belief replaced skepticism in his eyes, when he felt her breath on his cheek, faint and shallow but unmistakably there, and he started screaming, actually screaming, "Oh my God! Oh my God! She's alive! Call an ambulance! Someone call an ambulance right now!" The chapel exploded into pandemonium. People shouting and crying and running in different directions, some pulling out their phones to call 911, others crowding around the casket trying to see for themselves, and I stood there in the middle of it all, my mind unable to fully process what was happening, what I had just done, what it all meant. I felt someone grab my arm, and I turned to see Sarah staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, and she whispered something that sent chills down my spine. Something that made me realize this wasn't just a medical emergency. This was something far more sinister and deliberate. She said, "How did you know? How could you possibly know?" And there was such fear in her voice, such genuine terror, that I understood in that instant that this wasn't an accident, wasn't a mistake by a doctor who had pronounced Margaret dead prematurely. This was intentional, this was planned, and Sarah knew about it, was perhaps even part of it. I pulled my arm away from her and back toward the wall, suddenly feeling like I was in danger, like I had stumbled into something dark and dangerous that I didn't understand. And I watched as paramedics rushed into the chapel just minutes later, their equipment clattering, their voices professional and urgent as they carefully lifted Margaret from the casket and began assessing her vital signs. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, looked at me as they worked and asked, "You're the one who called it in?" And I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with emotion and fear, and she said, "You saved her life. Another 20 minutes and she would have been in the ground." Those words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my knees buckle, had to lean against the wall to keep from falling, because the reality of what had almost happened, what I had prevented, was suddenly overwhelming in its horror and its magnitude. The paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, placing an oxygen mask over Margaret's face, checking her pulse, her blood pressure, her pupils, speaking to each other in that medical shorthand that sounds like a foreign language to the rest of us, and I could see her eyelids fluttering slightly, could see signs of life returning to her body as they administered treatment and prepared to transport her to the hospital. I wanted to go with them, wanted to follow the ambulance and make sure she was going to be okay, but I was stopped by 2 police officers who had arrived with the paramedics, their faces serious and professional as they asked me to stay and give a statement about what I had witnessed. I remember sitting in a small office at the funeral home, my hands still shaking, trying to explain to the officers what I had seen, how I had noticed her chest moving, how I had known with absolute certainty that she was alive despite being in a casket at her own funeral. They listened carefully, taking notes, asking me to repeat certain details, and I could tell they were trying to determine whether this was criminal negligence on the part of a medical professional who had mistakenly declared her dead, or whether this was something far worse, something deliberate and premeditated. As I answered their questions, my mind kept returning to Sarah's reaction, to the fear in her eyes, to her question about how I could have known, and I found myself wondering if I should mention it to the police, if I should voice my suspicions that this might not have been an accident at all. But what could I say? That my colleague had looked scared when I stopped her aunt's funeral. That seemed like such flimsy evidence, such a weak foundation for an accusation that could ruin someone's life if I was wrong. So I said nothing about Sarah, nothing about my growing suspicions, and I simply focused on describing what I had observed, sticking to the facts, to the physical evidence of Margaret's breathing that I had witnessed with my own eyes. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, the police told me I was free to go, but that they would likely need to speak with me again as their investigation continued, and I left the funeral home in a daze, walking out into the cool October air, feeling like I had just lived through something that couldn't possibly have been real. Have you ever experienced something so surreal, so beyond the boundaries of normal life that you question whether it actually happened? Comment below if you've ever had a moment that changed everything. The drive home was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed, what I had done, and more importantly, what it all meant. I kept thinking about Margaret, wondering if she was conscious yet, wondering what she remembered, what she knew, whether she was aware that she had been about to be buried alive. That night I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except the image of that casket and the tiny movement of Margaret's chest that had changed everything. I scrolled through news websites obsessively, looking for any information about what had happened, but there was nothing yet. No reports, no updates, just silence from the media and from everyone involved. The next morning I called in sick to work, something I almost never did, but I couldn't face going to the office, couldn't face seeing Sarah, couldn't pretend that everything was normal when my entire world had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours. It was 3 days before I heard anything. 3 days of anxious waiting and obsessive internet searching and jumping every time my phone rang, and when the call finally came, it wasn't from the police, or from the hospital, or from anyone I expected. It was from Margaret herself. I remember staring at my phone in disbelief when the unknown number appeared, and when I answered, there was a long pause before I heard a woman's voice, weak and raspy, but unmistakably alive, saying my name, asking if I was the person who had stopped her funeral, who had saved her life. I sat down heavily on my couch, my legs suddenly unable to support me, and I said yes, that was me, and I asked her how she was, if she was okay, if she knew what had happened to her. Margaret's voice broke as she spoke, and I could hear the trauma and the confusion and the gratitude all mixed together in her words, as she told me that she was in the hospital, that the doctors were running tests, that she didn't remember much from before waking up in the ambulance, just fragments and shadows and a terrible sense of suffocation and panic. She said the doctors were calling it catalepsy, a rare condition where someone appears dead, but is actually in a state of suspended animation with barely detectable vital signs, and they were saying it was probably triggered by a severe reaction to medication she had been taking for anxiety. But even as she explained this to me, I could hear the doubt in her voice, could sense that she didn't quite believe this explanation herself, that there was something she wasn't saying, something she was afraid to voice even to the person who had saved her life. I asked her directly, trying to keep my voice calm and gentle, if she thought this was really just a medical accident, and there was another long pause before she whispered, so quietly I could barely hear her, "Can we meet? I need to talk to you in person. There are things I need to tell you, things I can't say over the phone." My heart started racing again, that same feeling of dread and anticipation I had felt in the funeral chapel washing over me, and I agreed immediately, giving her my address, telling her I would be there whenever she was ready, that I wanted to understand what had really happened as much as she did. She came to my apartment 2 days later, still looking pale and shaken, moving slowly like someone recovering from a serious illness, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there in person, alive and breathing, and real, I felt emotion well up in my throat so powerfully that I couldn't speak for a moment. We sat in my living room, and Margaret told me a story that was so disturbing, so calculated and cruel, that it made everything I thought I knew about human nature seem naive and innocent by comparison. She explained that she had been living with her brother Thomas and his wife Linda for the past year, ever since she had lost her job and couldn't afford her own apartment anymore, and she had been grateful for their generosity, had tried to be helpful and unobtrusive, had done everything she could to earn her keep and not be a burden. But about 6 months ago, she had accidentally overheard a conversation between Thomas and Linda, a conversation about their financial situation, about debts they couldn't pay, about creditors threatening to foreclose on their house, and most chillingly, about a life insurance policy that Thomas had taken out on Margaret years ago when she first started having health problems, a policy worth $500,000 that would solve all their financial problems if she were to die. Margaret's hands trembled as she continued her story, and I could see tears forming in her eyes as she described how she had tried to convince herself that she had misunderstood, that her brother would never actually harm her for money, that the conversation she had overheard was just stress talking, just desperate people venting their frustrations without any real intent behind the words. But then strange things started happening. Small things at first that she tried to rationalize away, her food tasting odd sometimes, finding pills in her bathroom that she didn't recognize, waking up feeling disoriented and sick without any clear reason why. She had started to feel paranoid, questioning everything, wondering if she was losing her mind or if there was really a conspiracy against her. And the worst part was having no one to talk to about it, because how do you tell someone that you think your own brother is trying to kill you without sounding absolutely insane? The anxiety had gotten worse and worse, and her doctor had prescribed her medication to help her sleep and calm her nerves. Medication that Linda always helpfully made sure she took every night, bringing her a glass of water and watching her swallow the pills with a smile that Margaret now realized was the smile of someone watching their plan unfold perfectly. She told me that her last clear memory before waking up in the ambulance was taking those pills on a Wednesday night, feeling unusually dizzy and strange, trying to call out for help as her vision went dark and her body became paralyzed, unable to move or speak but still conscious, still aware, trapped in her own body like being buried alive before actually being buried alive. The doctors had confirmed that the cataleptic state she had been in was indeed caused by medication, but not the medication that was prescribed to her. It was a combination of drugs that shouldn't have been together, drugs that had been deliberately mixed to create exactly this effect, to make her appear dead to a cursory examination, while keeping her in a state of suspended animation that would eventually kill her once she was sealed in the casket and deprived of oxygen. Margaret looked at me with such intensity, such raw vulnerability, and said, "They were going to bury me alive. My own brother and his wife were going to kill me for insurance money. And if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't seen me breathing, I would be dead right now, suffocated in a box 6 feet under the ground." I felt sick to my stomach, felt rage and horror and disbelief all churning together inside me. And I asked her why she hadn't gone to the police immediately, why she had called me first, and she explained that she had gone to the police, had told them everything. But they were skeptical because there was no concrete proof, no smoking gun, just her word against her brother's, and Thomas and Linda were claiming that it must have been a terrible accident, that they had no idea how those drugs had gotten into her system, that they were devastated by what had happened and relieved she was alive. The police were investigating, running toxicology tests, interviewing people, but Margaret was terrified that without solid evidence, Thomas and Linda would get away with it, would try again, would finish what they had started, and she felt like I was the only person who truly understood what had happened, who had been there and witnessed the truth, who could help her prove what had really occurred. I want you to really think about this for a moment. Imagine being in a situation where your own family, people who are supposed to love and protect you, are actively trying to end your life for money, and the systems that are supposed to keep you safe are moving too slowly, too cautiously while your would-be killers walk free and have access to you, have opportunities to try again. That's the nightmare that Margaret was living, and as she sat in my living room telling me this story, I knew that I couldn't just walk away, couldn't just tell her I was sorry and wish her luck and go back to my normal life pretending this had never happened. Something fundamental had shifted inside me when I saw her chest moving in that casket, when I made the decision to speak up despite the social pressure and the fear of being wrong. And now I felt a responsibility to see this through, to help her get justice, to make sure that Thomas and Linda couldn't hurt her or anyone else ever again. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and I became unlikely partners in investigation, spending hours going through her medical records, her prescriptions, her financial documents, anything that might provide evidence of what had been done to her and who had done it. We discovered that Thomas had been forging her signature on insurance documents, increasing the payout on her policy without her knowledge, and that Linda had been the one picking up Margaret's prescriptions from the pharmacy, which meant she had access to modify them or add additional medications. We found search histories on the shared family computer about catalepsy, about drugs that could induce death-like states, about how long someone could survive in a sealed casket, all searched from Linda's user account in the weeks leading up to the funeral. The evidence was mounting, but it was all circumstantial, nothing that would definitely prove intent in a court of law. And Margaret was getting more and more frightened as Thomas and Linda became aware that she was investigating them, that she was building a case against them. They started calling her constantly, leaving voicemails full of fake concern and barely veiled threats, showing up at places they knew she would be, making it clear that they knew what she was doing and that they weren't going to let her destroy their lives without a fight. I remember one particularly terrifying night when Margaret called me at 2 a.m, her voice panicked and breathless, telling me that someone had tried to break into the hotel room where she had been staying, that she had heard them trying to force the lock, that she had called hotel security and the person had fled before they could be caught. I drove to the hotel immediately, stayed with her for the rest of the night, and that's when we both realized that this had become dangerous, that we were dealing with people who had already tried to kill once, and who were desperate and cornered and willing to do anything to protect themselves from consequences. Have you ever felt truly hunted, truly unsafe in your own life? Drop a comment if you've experienced that kind of fear. We decided we needed to be more strategic, more careful, and we reached out to a private investigator that a lawyer friend of mine recommended, someone who specialized in cases like this, someone who could help us gather the kind of evidence that would be irrefutable in court. The private investigator, a woman named Detective Janet Rivera, who had retired from the police force and started her own agency, took our case seriously from the very first meeting, listening to everything we had to say without judgment or skepticism, reviewing all the evidence we had collected with a professional eye that gave us hope that maybe, finally, someone with experience and resources was on our side. Janet explained that what we needed was a confession, something recorded and documented that would prove intent, and she suggested setting up a controlled situation where Margaret would confront Thomas and Linda while wearing a wire, trying to get them to admit what they had done, to reveal details that only the perpetrators would know. It was risky, potentially dangerous, but Margaret was determined to do it, to face her brother and his wife and make them accountable for what they had tried to do to her. We spent days preparing, going over possible scenarios, practicing what Margaret would say, how she would respond to different reactions, and Janet brought in backup surveillance, people who would be nearby to intervene if the situation became violent or threatening. The confrontation was set up to happen at the house where Margaret had been living, the house where she had been poisoned, and I insisted on being there too, hiding in the surveillance van with Janet, listening through headphones as Margaret walked back into that place of trauma and terror. I will never forget the sound of her voice as she entered the house, calling out for Thomas and Linda, her words steady despite what I knew must have been overwhelming fear. And when they came into the room, the initial moments of surprise and fake happiness at seeing her, asking how she was feeling, if she needed anything, all while Margaret stood there knowing what they had done, what they had tried to do, and she started asking questions, pointed questions about her medication, about the insurance policy, about the funeral arrangements they had made so quickly. I could hear the tension escalating in their voices, Thomas getting defensive, Linda trying to deflect, and then Margaret said something brilliant, something we had rehearsed, but that took on new power in the actual moment. She told them she had remembered something from when she was in the cataleptic state, that she had been conscious, had heard them talking, had heard Linda saying that the dose should have been stronger, that she should have been completely unresponsive by the time of the funeral. It was a bluff, a calculated risk to see if they would deny something they had never said or if they would react in a way that confirmed guilt. And the silence that followed was so long and so heavy that I held my breath, listening through the headphones, my heart pounding, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Linda laughed, actually laughed, a cold, bitter sound that had no humor in it, and she said, "You couldn't have heard that because you were supposed to be dead, completely gone, not just sleeping." Thomas tried to shush her, told her to be quiet, but Linda was done pretending, done maintaining the facade, and she started talking, telling Margaret exactly what they had done, how they had planned it, how they had researched the drugs, how they had calculated the doses, how they had bribed the funeral home director to skip certain examination procedures, how they had been so careful, so meticulous, and how one stranger at the funeral had ruined everything they had worked for. The confession came pouring out of Linda like poison from a wound, and Thomas joined in. The two of them actually arguing about whose idea it had been, who had been more committed to the plan, who had done more of the actual work, and Margaret stood there taking it all in, keeping them talking, asking clarifying questions that got more and more details on the recording, details about dates and times and specific actions that would be absolutely damning in court. I was simultaneously horrified and amazed, listening to two people casually discuss murder like it was a business transaction, justifying their actions by talking about their financial problems, about how Margaret was going to die eventually anyway, about how the insurance money would save their house and their future. And didn't they deserve that? Didn't they deserve to be happy after all they had done for her? Letting her live with them, feeding her, taking care of her. The selfishness and the cruelty in their words made me feel physically ill, and I saw Janet shaking her head in disgust as she monitored the conversation, her hand on her radio ready to call in the backup team if things went wrong. But Margaret held her ground, kept her composure even as her brother and his wife admitted to attempting to murder her, and when she finally asked them directly, "So you were going to let me suffocate in that casket? Let me die alone and terrified in the dark?" Linda responded with something so chilling, so devoid of empathy that it still haunts me. She said, "You wouldn't have known for long. The oxygen would have run out in a few hours. It would have been like going to sleep." That was the moment Janet signaled the backup team, and within seconds police officers stormed into the house and I could hear the commotion through the headphones, Thomas and Linda shouting in surprise, and then in denial, claiming they had been joking, that it was a sick joke to cope with the trauma of almost losing Margaret. But the recording didn't lie. Their words didn't lie. And they were arrested right there in the living room. I ran from the surveillance van into the house, found Margaret standing in the middle of chaos, police officers everywhere, her brother and his wife being handcuffed and read their rights, and when she saw me, she collapsed into my arms, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, releasing months of fear and stress and trauma all at once, and I held her, telling her it was over. She was safe. They couldn't hurt her anymore. Justice was coming. The trial happened 6 months later, and I testified about what I had seen at the funeral, about the movement I had witnessed, about the decision to speak up, and the jury heard the recording of Linda and Thomas confessing to their crime, heard the evidence about the forged insurance documents, the drug interactions, the bribes to the funeral home, and it took them less than 4 hours to come back with a guilty verdict on charges of attempted murder and insurance fraud. Thomas got 25 years, Linda got 22, and watching them being led away to begin their sentences, I felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice had been served, that Margaret was safe and vindicated, but sadness that it had come to this, that family bonds could be so easily broken by greed and desperation. Margaret and I stayed close after the trial, forging a friendship that had been born in trauma, but had grown into something genuine and meaningful, built on trust and mutual respect, and the shared experience of having faced something dark together and survived. She started therapy to process everything that had happened to her, to work through the betrayal and the fear and the complicated grief of losing her brother not to death but to his own choices, and I watched her slowly rebuild her life, finding a new job, moving into her own apartment, starting to trust people again little by little. She told me once that what haunted her most wasn't the physical experience of being in the casket, though that was certainly traumatic, but the knowledge that the people she had trusted most in the world had looked at her and seen dollar signs instead of a human being, had been willing to listen to her die rather than deal with their financial problems in a legal way. And how does someone recover from that kind of betrayal? How do you learn to trust again when the people who were supposed to love you tried to kill you? These were questions she grappled with in therapy and in our many long conversations, and I didn't have good answers, could only listen and support her, and remind her that not everyone is capable of that kind of evil, that there are still good people in the world, people who will do the right thing even when it's difficult or awkward or socially uncomfortable. She said that I had restored her faith in humanity by being willing to speak up at her funeral, by being willing to look foolish or create a scene in order to save someone I didn't even know, And that single act of courage had given her the strength to fight back, to pursue justice, to refuse to be a victim. I tried to downplay my role, to insist that anyone would have done the same thing, but she shook her head and said, "But they didn't. There were 40 people in that chapel, and only you saw me breathing. Only you cared enough to say something. Only you valued a stranger's life enough to risk embarrassing yourself." And she was right. I had talked to some of the other attendees afterward, and several of them admitted they had felt something was off, had felt uncomfortable, but hadn't wanted to cause a scene, hadn't wanted to question the authorities and experts who had declared Margaret dead. It made me think about how many times we stay silent in the face of injustice or wrongdoing, because we don't want to rock the boat, don't want to be the person who speaks up and potentially makes a fool of themselves, and how that silence enables harm to continue, allows bad things to happen because good people are too polite or too scared to intervene. This experience changed me fundamentally, made me question a lot of assumptions I had held about social norms and proper behavior, made me realize that sometimes the most important thing you can do is exactly the thing that feels most uncomfortable, most socially awkward, most likely to make you stand out. 3 years have passed since that October day when I stopped a funeral and saved a life, and the ripple effects of that moment continue to spread outward in ways I never could have anticipated. Margaret has become an advocate for awareness about medical errors and the importance of thorough death examinations, speaking at conferences and writing articles about her experience, turning her trauma into something that might prevent similar situations from happening to others. She's even lobbied for legislation in our state that would require multiple medical professionals to confirm death before funeral arrangements can proceed. And while the bill is still working its way through the legislative process, there's real momentum behind it, real change happening because one woman refused to let her near-death experience be in vain. As for me, I left my marketing job about a year after the trial, feeling like I needed to do something more meaningful with my life, something that aligned with the values I had discovered in myself that day at the funeral, and I went back to school to become a social worker, focusing on elder abuse prevention and advocacy, helping vulnerable people who might not have anyone else looking out for them. The work is hard and often heartbreaking, but it feels right in a way that my previous career never did. Feels like I'm honoring the choice I made to speak up for Margaret by continuing to speak up for people who can't always speak for themselves. Margaret and I still have dinner together once a month, and we've developed a tradition of going to that same funeral home every October on the anniversary of the day everything happened, not in a morbid way, but as a celebration of survival, of justice, of the power of paying attention and trusting your instincts even when doing so feels crazy. The funeral home staff has changed since then. The director who accepted bribes from Thomas and Linda lost his license and went to prison for his role in the conspiracy. But the new owners know our story and always welcome us warmly, understanding that we need to confront that place and those memories in order to fully move past them. We stand in the chapel where it all happened, and we remember, and then we leave and go have dessert at a cafe nearby, celebrating life and second chances and the beautiful complexity of human connection. What I've learned from all of this, what I want you to understand, is that the moments that define our lives aren't always the ones we plan for or expect. They're the split-second decisions we make when confronted with something wrong, something unjust, something that demands action despite our fear or uncertainty. I could have stayed silent that day, could have convinced myself that I was seeing things or that surely the professionals knew better than I did, and Margaret would be dead, and 2 murderers would have gotten away with the perfect crime, and I would be living my life never knowing the difference I could have made. But I spoke up. I trusted what I saw. I valued a stranger's life over my own comfort, and that choice created a cascade of consequences that saved a life, brought criminals to justice, forged an incredible friendship, and ultimately changed the trajectory of my entire existence. So I want to ask you something, and I really want you to think about this seriously. Have you ever been in a situation where you saw something wrong, something that demanded action, but you stayed silent because it was easier or safer or less awkward? We all have those moments, those times when we choose comfort over courage, and I'm not judging anyone because I've been there too, many times before that October day. But I want to challenge you to think differently going forward, to consider that the next time you see something that doesn't feel right, whether it's someone being mistreated, someone in danger, someone being taken advantage of, you have a choice in that moment, and your choice matters more than you might think. It matters to the person who needs help, obviously, but it also matters to you, to who you are and who you want to be. Because every time we choose courage over comfort, we strengthen that part of ourselves. We become more the person we want to be, more the person the world needs us to be. Margaret often says that I saved her life, but the truth is more complicated than that. Yes, I stopped her funeral. Yes, my actions led to her rescue and her eventual justice. But she saved something in me too. Saved me from a life of passive acceptance and comfortable complacency. Woke me up to the reality that we all have power to make a difference if we're willing to use it, willing to risk being wrong or looking foolish in service of doing what's right. Have you ever had an experience that completely changed your perspective on life? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to act when they need to. Now, if this story touched you in any way, if it made you think about your own choices and your own capacity for courage, I want to ask you to do a few things for me. First, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your own experiences, or even just letting me know that this message resonated with you. Because the conversation doesn't end when the video ends, and your voice matters, your story matters, and I genuinely want to hear from you. Second, if you found value in this story, if you think it's important for people to understand that one person really can make a difference, that speaking up matters, that paying attention and trusting your instincts can literally save lives, then please hit that like button, because it helps this message reach more people, helps ensure that this story isn't just entertainment but actually has impact, actually makes people think and potentially act differently in their own lives. Third, and this is really important to me, I want you to subscribe to I Live to Tell, because we share stories like this all the time, stories about real people facing extraordinary circumstances, making difficult choices, surviving impossible situations, and learning profound lessons that all of us can benefit from hearing. These aren't just stories for entertainment, though I hope they are compelling and engaging. They're stories that remind us of our shared humanity, our capacity for both good and evil, our power to change lives through the choices we make every single day. And finally, please hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story, because you never know which one might be exactly what you need to hear at exactly the right moment in your life. The story that gives you courage, or wisdom, or perspective, or hope when you need it most. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, for being part of this community of people who believe that stories matter, that sharing our experiences and learning from each other makes us all stronger and wiser and more compassionate. Margaret and I are both grateful that our story reached you today, and we hope that it makes a difference in your life the way that October afternoon made a difference in ours. Remember, you never know when you might be in a position to save someone's life or change their trajectory completely. Stay alert, stay compassionate, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of speaking up when something doesn't feel right. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and remember that you live to tell your story too, whatever it may be.